Episode 274. Kit Klarenberg. The FTX Web of Corruption.
Kit Klarenberg, welcome back to the show.
Hey, how's it going?
Thank you so much for being back on. You were actually on my show Uncensored earlier this year, which is now available on Rumble. But I wanted to have you on today to talk about a couple of very important issues, and one of them is the big FTX scandal. And this has been a major headline over recent weeks. You know, it's funny looking back just about a month or two before the election, the head of FTX, Sam Bankman-Fried, he was being hailed as this genius, this young billionaire. He was on shows like Meet the Press. And now he's been exposed pretty much as a financial criminal, allegedly. So just to go into this a little bit, could you first give us some background on Sam Bankman-Fried and just explain who this person is and what his family connections are?
So Sam Bankman-Fried is now 30-year-old founder of FTX. He's been hailed as this tech guru and genius for 3 years. He is used to work in finance. In April 2019, which is the same month that Joe Biden announces his presidential run, Bankman-Fried launches FTX. And he has no background in political activism or donations, or he didn't seem to exhibit any interest whatsoever in politics before this. Very quickly, he becomes one of the Democrats' biggest donors. He was the second biggest donor to Joe Biden in the 2020 presidential campaign. He was the party's second biggest donor in 2021 and 2022, funneling tens of millions to fund their election activity, election campaigns. Now, what's quite interesting is his mother is a Harvard academic who runs a super PAC, which is involved in raising money for Democratic candidates. It's extremely shady and shadowy. It has no website. The people involved don't advertise that they work that they're working on this on their LinkedIn profiles. And they also take money from uncertain sources. They raise money in Silicon Valley, but the actual donors are undisclosed. And then they send this money anonymously to candidates that they pick using a variety of analytics tools. And yes, I mean, these people are often unaware who or what is giving them money. So that's quite a striking feature. But so at the start of this year, what would say the first half of this year, Bankman-Fried has a number of high-level meetings at the White House, and subsequent to this, announces he's going to give $1 billion to the Democratic Party, which is an absolutely staggering figure. He rose back on this significantly in mid-October, and he says it not only was the proposal, the $1 billion proposal done, quote unquote, but he will no longer be giving any money to political parties, which is quite a strange volte-face. But then 2 weeks later, FTX starts imploding, and so I mean, there's obvious questions there about whether he knew something was coming, and indeed, if it was the case that the FTX was effectively a means of raising money for the Democrats, was he asked to roll back on his funding pledges, because they generated an enormous amount of media coverage and interest. When people talk about having billions to spend on political campaigns, regulators start looking into them. And it was mere days after he said that he was no longer going to be giving money to political parties that financial regulators in Texas opened an official probe into FTX's business practices on the basis they believed that they might be selling illegal securities. It's since been revealed that earlier this year there were prosecutors in New York were looking into FTX, and I mean, it seems now we're kind of having this almost minute by minute coverage of FTX's implosion. We're learning more and more about how FTX was effectively fraudulent from top to bottom. Sam Bankman-Fried is linked to 134 shell companies, which is quite extraordinary. They will no doubt have been used for tax evasion and money laundering and other various activities. And despite this huge focus, as of today, and I'm sure this will be the case when this episode goes out too, the mainstream media has completely ignored a massive elephant in the room, which is that in March this year, Sam Bankman-Fried, in collaboration with the Ukrainian government, set up a resource called Aid for Ukraine to funnel crypto donations to Kiev to be used in their war effort for, bullets and bandages and other kind of war material. I have written about this fairly extensively. I'm keeping a close eye on it, and yeah, the questions just keep stacking up. The concerns keep stacking up, and there's been no clarity on all of these very obvious conflicts of interest and all these very clear concerns about what Aid for Ukraine is actually was and indeed is actually doing. So, for instance, I found, going through Internet Archives, that 2 weeks after this launched, or 2.5 weeks after this launched, the website is updated. It had a dedicated website, and there was a page of the Ukrainian government's website. On April 1st, it's updated to state that 70 million had been raised via crypto. 5 days later, this has changed down to 60 million. So already that's 10 million that seems to have potentially gone missing. I mean, unless they made a mistake, although, I mean, it seems like quite an extraordinary error to make. And this figure has remained unchanged ever since. And there are numerous Ukrainian government officials and crypto bros who are involved in this mechanism, who state, yes, that FTX's services were only used in March, and the resource only raised funds in March. But you can see, because it has all of the various crypto tokens or keys through which they're raising funds. They've been accepting money all along, and they've raised millions and millions of dollars. But this is not reflected on their website, and indeed, yes, it seems people connected to this venture themselves are sticking with the 60 million line. So yeah, I mean, where has this money gone? What has it been spent on? Has it been embezzled? Is it funding black operations, kind of off books, so to speak? There might be exculpatory answers to these questions, but so far, those questions have been dodged.
Well, there have been many folks out there who have characterized this as a money laundering operation. And just to be clear, this has been deemed to be a conspiracy theory. And there's actually, if you post about this, there have been memes that have been hidden by Facebook and whatnot, saying that this is a disproven conspiracy theory with no evidence. But the conspiracy theory was that Ukraine was effectively giving money to FTX, and that money was being washed through FTX and going to Democrats who are largely backing aid for Ukraine. Also, many or several establishment Republicans as well. I believe he was also donating to them. So again, this has been deemed to be unproven and a conspiracy theory. Do you think that there may be any validity to this, or looking into this, or do you also think that this is just too much of a simplification of what was happening?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's no evidence that the Ukrainian government gave funds were laundered and then sent to the Democrats. And what's quite interesting, I mean, you mentioned censorship. Instagram removed a post from the Grayzone's official account publicizing my article on this. The fact check, quote unquote, stated that the article was promoting the conspiracy theory that Aid for Ukraine was a money laundering scheme for the Democrats. Not only did my article not make this allegation, I explicitly stated there was no evidence to support that charge. What I am saying is that there is at least a potential that funds that were raised via Aid for Ukraine were, yes, as I say, embezzled or were funneled elsewhere. But I mean, there's quite clearly a political aspect to this. I find it interesting that it's red states that seem to, regulators that seem to be, to have been taking an interest in FTX before the scandal erupted. The same is obviously not true of kind of the Democrat-controlled federal institutions, or there are no kind of blue states where this happened. But I think, yeah, it would be unsurprising if FTX itself, yes, I mean, it does give every appearance of having been at least in part intended to raise money for the Democrats. And yes, Sam Bankman-Fried has quite clearly top-level connections to the Democratic Party in the White House. There are former Obama administration officials who were employed by FTX. So there is clearly a political component there. You know, I mean, support for the war in Ukraine seems fairly bipartisan in the US. I think that, you know, were the Republicans in office, I don't think things would be very different. I mean, they like to claim so, but I mean, you know, there's very little indication that that would be the case. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think at the very, very least, you could say, right, well, you know, this money has gone missing. Where is it gone? I mean, it seems kind of implausible that it would be redirected back to the US. And or you mean, you know, FTX itself, there's the initial filing in bankruptcy court by the court-appointed CEO of FTX, and Sam Bankman-Fried has been removed from his post, although you know, he's not in jail, bizarrely. He wrote an initial kind of overview of FTX's finances, and he found, I mean, this is a guy who oversaw Enron's bankruptcy, by the way. He found a total lack of financial record keeping. You know, it was very unclear how the businesses operated, who worked for what, and indeed whether some employees even existed. He mentions that he was unable to track down several people who were listed as staff. So again, I mean, that's in itself is extremely questionable and very, very, very dubious. And that in turn, actually, it raises another kind of core element to the mystery, is that FTX managed to generate billions in venture capital funding from like top tier VC firms. And also, yeah, like it was valued in the billions by those same VC firms. Now,
right, and you would have to show your financial statements to those venture capital firms, right? Like you would have to kind of let them see behind the curtain.
Yeah, and it's like, and it's interesting. So I, you know, had a background as many years ago. I was a financial journalist. I met with, you know, the heads of VC firms. You know, these people are, you know, they're capitalist shitbags of the highest order. They are, you know, out to make money however they can. They are maybe potentially unscrupulous in how they do it on occasion. They're not stupid. And they also, you know, it is a mystery how they seem to have fallen, you know, for this very obvious con. And it seems in some quarters there's speculation that, oh, well, the VCs fell for the kind of cult of Bankman-Fried. They were kind of drawn in by the mythos, and you know that wouldn't happen, as you say. They would want very detailed, you know, financial records. They would want access to every bit of paper the firm had in order to make a judgment whether to invest, let alone to value it so highly. And so that's a real mystery. And it's very, very, very strange. And I mean, again, like this is just speculation, which I don't you know, enjoy. I don't engage in speculation. I try to avoid it. But like, it does raise the prospect that there's potentially a CIA interest in FTX, to my mind. So In-Q-Tel, which is the CIA's venture capital arm, it is a highly influential organization within the VC sphere. By its own calculations, for every dollar it invests in business, $15 will be invested by other VC firms. So there's a kind of multiplier effect. And it doesn't always advertise its investments publicly. We do know, however, that the CIA it has for many years taken a very keen interest in crypto. And the CIA chief a few years back admitted that the agency was working on a number of crypto projects. So, I mean, you know, the financial opacity of FTX, the kind of clout and credibility, you know, that was kind of implied by working there, you know, and indeed, yes, all of those shell companies, that would have been attractive to the CIA, certainly. And I think that, you know, you don't reach the heights that Sam Bankman-Fried did, and you don't have all of these, you know, wealthy, powerful people, you know, promoting you in public and giving you vast amounts of money without someone vouching for you along the way. Who or what that was, we don't know. But yes, it's a very curious feature. And like I say, I find it very odd that he's, you know, not in jail. I mean, there were initial reports that he was under supervision by the authorities in the Bahamas. He's since appeared via live stream at various events, and he still uses Twitter. I mean, that does imply some level of protection, or indeed that, you know, there are certain untouchables within the structure who don't want this looked at, and therefore no one is.
That's the amazing thing about this too, is that this corruption seems to have been exposed to a large degree, where, you know, it's getting talked about on all the major financial networks, as it, you know, it kind of has to be, because FTX got so big and because of, you know, the investments in other companies and whatnot. So do you think long term that, you know, this scandal is going to grow, or is it just going to end up getting swept under the rug like so many other scandals? Again, just because it seems so profound. Even the new head of the Democratic leadership, who just got elected in the House, Hakeem Jeffries, he also received money from FTX, as well as, you know, lots of other Democrats, and again, several other Republicans as well. So is it possible for them to even sweep this under the rug at this point?
Well, I mean, it's interesting, yes, that there are all these pictures of Sam Bankman-Fried grinning alongside the very lawmakers who are meant to be investigating him and his firm. That does tend to suggest that they will not approach it honestly, and that they will leave certain stones unturned. You know, I mean, again, I mean, you know, I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Guggenheim Bank, but like, this was effectively a CIA bank in Australia that was, you know, used for funding CIA operations. You know, was responsible for the flow of heroin into Australia for like the very first time. You know, and like, you know, that was a absolutely huge scandal which erupted very briefly and then was swept under the rug. And, you know, the official inquiry into this concluded that there was no evidence to suggest that the CIA had any role in this bank, even though, I mean, the evidence was abundant, and they even reference it in their own report exonerating the company. But yeah, I mean, you know, the fact that so many people lost money means that there needs to be an appearance, at the very least, of authorities taking an interest in this. You know, but there's all sorts of, I mean, again, in terms of protection, there's all sorts of, you know, very strange, odd little kernels that have arisen. So, for instance, Sam Bankman-Fried invested tens of millions in a very small bank in a rural part of the US that had about 100 customers and mainly issues farm loans. And this was not only, you know, his investment in it was not only many times the bank's assets under management, it was also, you know, many times its actual value. Now, you know, I mean, this is a bank that doesn't offer credit cards or online banking. You know, why? And yeah, people looking at this have said that this should have been a massive red flag to regulators. But, you know, it went through apparently, you know, unmolested. Now, again, that does seem to suggest that, you know, and either we have a situation where all of these different individuals and organizations that should have seen what was coming, you know, they were you know, to one way or another turning a blind eye, or they were just completely in the dark about this. I mean, yeah, it's all very, very odd. And you would think that at some stage in the past 3 years, you know, one person would have raised concerns publicly, or there would have been some kind of. I mean, this is a company that it seems it didn't have any audited accounts for Alameda Research, which is the other SBF company that seems to effectively have been the same as FTX. Which Sam Bankman-Fried is funneling billions to. They weren't fully audited, and they seem to have recruited an auditor via the metaverse. Again, like, it boggles the mind, really. So, you know, quite clearly, I would suggest he was allowed to do this, and there was something or someone behind him who was actually effectively running the show, and, you know, you know, telling investigators where not to look, and, you know, ensuring that he had free reign to carry on. So yeah, I mean, again, after an initial burst of enthusiasm, the media around this seems to be dying down. Sam Bankman-Fried appears to have gotten the story straight insofar as he claims it was all a big accident, and he actually did have the money, and if it hadn't gone to bankruptcy, if they hadn't filed for bankruptcy, they would have been able to, you know, refund all their customers and everything. And again, you know, that he seems to, apart from, you know, certain critical voices, you know, these comments are passed unchallenged. So, I mean, perhaps in a few months' time, we'll see a rehabilitation of Bankman-Fried, or indeed this will just vanish forever. I mean, I'm determined to not let it, and I'm keeping a very close eye on filings around this.
Well, something else that's very interesting about Sam Bankman-Fried is that he was also nominally in support of regulation, and that was really, what his supposed lobbying efforts were about to a large degree, is that he wanted the crypto space regulated. And I know that Kim Iverson asked you about this on your interview with her, when she suggested maybe this whole thing may be an attempt to discredit crypto. I know that lately there has been a lot of talk around these central bank digital currencies. Do you have any concerns about these central bank digital currencies, and just how regulation may occur of cryptocurrencies, which originally were intended to be kind of a way for people to do business outside of using traditional financial methods?
Yeah, but it's interesting, what Bankman-Fried was lobbying for, before his fall from grace, was regulation that would favour centralised exchanges, such as his own. I mean, whether this was just self-interested, kind of business motivated, or whether there was something deeper is again an open question. I mean, yes, this whole scandal has done a lot to discredit crypto. I mean, he's almost, Sam Bankman-Fried himself is almost from central casting in terms of how the average person might perceive a crypto bro. He's young, clearly not very intelligent, and is has a huge appetite for risk. It certainly has. I mean, I know several people who invest in crypto who are extremely concerned about the entire sector, and have significantly reduced, if not outright sold, all of their crypto holdings as a result of this. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly, again, coincidence or not, around the time that FTX collapsed, a trial for a digital dollar was rolled out in the US. In the UK, in response to FTX's collapse, the Bank of England said that they might be considering issuing a digital pound. I mean, quite why the collapse of a cryptocurrency exchange means that you should start thinking about this is again not particularly clear. I mean, I think, if we go the route of, well, this has served to discredit crypto, then yeah, I mean, it kind of reinforces that, right, well, you can only trust established financial products and institutions, and that's where you should keep your money, and they'll keep you and your money safe. Yeah, I mean, there's more generally, there has been for a very long time a push for digital currencies the world over. I mean, frequently when I've met some of the advocates for this, they seem to be very true believers, in digital currency. They seem completely ignorant, if not kind of deaf and dumb to the and blind to the very obvious issues that digital currencies raise, such as surveillance, such as, yes, like centralizing everyone's financial transactions, and not allowing people to make off books, as it were, payments one way or another. I mean, from the government's point of view, that is, that's like all their Christmases have come at once, like when they have that level of control. And also, I mean, we've seen that with Russia and the sanctions, or there's been at least an attempt to completely cut Russia out of global financial systems. That could easily be applied to an individual, and you're not going to get if you're like on the run, say, you're not going to get very far if you haven't got any money, and indeed, no one's able to give you any because it's all digital.
Well, turning back to Ukraine and just the aid that's going to Ukraine, I heard you mention in another interview that a lot of the money and weapons that is going to Ukraine is not actually even reaching the Ukrainian government or reaching the front lines. At least it's going somewhere else. So could you just go into that a little bit? Like, how much of these billions and billions of dollars and this advanced weaponry do we think is actually going to this conflict against Russia, and how much is ending up on the black market?
I mean, it's really difficult to tell the scale of the corruption and embezzlement that's going on. I mean, the arms and aid, quote unquote, shipments to Ukraine just get bigger and bigger. There's billions is ending up in Kiev. There seems to be very little control over where it goes, and very little safeguards in place to prevent abuses. There are now a few US military advisors in Ukraine who are specifically charged with making sure everything reaches where it's meant to reach. Again, I mean, I don't think that's the necessary infrastructure to ensure that this happens. I mean, there's been some acknowledgement in the media that the corruption and profiteering is going on. There was of course, I believe it was in August, a CBS documentary that talked about how only 30% of what gets sent to Ukraine actually makes it to the front, and then there was a huge online backlash against CBS, so they pulled the documentary and they from their website temporarily, and then they reinstated it to claim that things are a lot better now, which is reassuring. But I mean, if you actually look at there are a number of interviews which have gotten zero mainstream media traction with people who fought in the International Legion, that was created on, I think it was February 27th. It was to attract foreign fighters and mercenaries to go and fight in Ukraine. And pretty much every single one of these interviews that I've seen, they say that they saw like embezzlement, fraud and corruption on an absolutely massive scale, where it was very professionalized, where even in the event that weapons arrived, another van would turn up and then take some away. There was one, I believe it was an American merc, who said that he reported these matters to the SBU. The SBU did nothing. The commanders who were implicated in this would threaten to send people on suicide missions to silence them. In one case, there was a unit of foreign soldiers who the commanders didn't like very much, so they sent them across a minefield without telling them there were any mines under the soil. I mean, it just seems to be an environment in which you cannot raise these concerns, and if you do, there are very, very, very dire consequences. But I mean, where I am now, in Serbia, this entire the Balkans throughout the 90s was a major target for US weapons, and they were flown in to fight against the Serbs, basically, in Croatia and Bosnia, and unaccountably vast shipments of weapons were made every single week. That one of the reasons that they were flown in on CIA planes. One of the reasons they were so big is because they knew that the second that the weaponry arrived, between 20 to 50% of it would be sold pretty much immediately. I met someone in Sarajevo this summer, that's the capital of Bosnia, who said that when he was growing up, his entire family, including like his grandma and like his sisters, were involved in a gun smuggling operation because there were no other jobs. So it was like a major employer. Those weapons circulate to this day. They were used in the war in Kosovo in the late 90s. The international arms black market is implausibly fluid. There was a report a few years back that there was a teenage drug gang in the north of England that had the kind of elite machine guns that were used by British special forces in Afghanistan. Like how did they end up there? And so it's I mean, I think one of the major concerns is, you want to talk about blowback. Like, effectively, I mean, it does seem fairly inevitable now that Russia is going to, emerge victorious. It's going to be a very long, grinding war, but it seems fairly inevitable. And, in that context, you're going to have a lot of very pissed off, embittered former fighters, among them many neo-Nazis, of course, who have ready access to vast amounts of weaponry. And I mean, there's already my Grayzone colleague Alex Rubinstein has reported on another story that has gotten zero mainstream traction of a neo-Nazi cell in Italy, comprised of people who fought in Ukraine, who were planning terrorist attacks. So that's, already before the war's even over. This is a reality and a major threat.
Yeah, no, we've seen blowback again and again. Actually, we've been talking about Iranian drones being used by Russia. I believe that the whole reason that Iran even has drones is because they captured a U.S. drone being used in Iraq and Afghanistan previously. And we've seen not just all the weapons that were left in Afghanistan recently, but also the funding of the Mujahideen and how that created Al Qaeda and whatnot. So it just seems as though there's no like long-term thinking, at least on the part of maybe people in the media or whatnot. Probably in the intelligence community there is some long-term thinking, but yeah, it's just it's remarkable how there's no thought into how these weapons are inevitably going to end up in the hands of these people who were involved in the right sector, in the Azov battalion, the Adar battalion, and we could see international right-wing terrorism because of the weapons that we're sending to Ukraine now.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like, I mean, there's an absolutely fascinating interview, which is there's a Telegram channel run by this guy who goes by the name of John Fearless, and he highlights human rights abuses in Ukraine. He conducted this interview with an American neo-Nazi called Boneface, because he has his face is tattooed to make it resemble a skull. He was jailed in the US for effectively trying to create a fascist terror army, and that was going to carry out terror attacks and carry out pursue insurrection. But like he in this interview, he makes a number of very interesting comments where he states that he first went to Ukraine in 2014 because the neo-Nazi movement globally is highly coordinated. So his local network in the US was very aware of the huge presence of far right nationalists in Maidan, and as such, he ventured over there, and then he met a large number of skinheads from all over the world who had similarly been attracted by the prospect of creating a kind of neo-Nazi state in Ukraine. So yeah, I mean, I think that as the US has done many times in the past to its allies, it will throw Ukraine under a bus. I mean, that day seems to be getting sooner. I mean, there's slightly more critical reporting emerging in the mainstream. There are officials, both anonymous and openly, stating that they think that Ukraine's going to lose, and that Zelensky needs to get serious about negotiating. So I mean, yes, that day will come, and there will be a lot of people who are extremely angry. I mean, again, another interesting historical parallel here is, I mentioned the arms shipments to Bosnia and Croatia. Those CIA planes were also bringing in large amounts of Mujahideen fighters from all over the world, and the Bosnian Mujahideen quickly gained a reputation for carrying out the most brutal acts, perpetrating false flags, like killing their own people and claiming the Serbs did it to try and facilitate US airstrikes, and at the end of the war, when their kind of utility was all used up, the CIA started taking them out. They started assassinating the Mujahideen fighters there, and then so they fled to Kosovo. Most of them tried to, and en route there, they ended up getting arrested in Albania because the CIA had basically put burn notices on them. A large number of them were deported back to their home countries, including, I think, the largest contingent was Cairo, where there was it was the biggest terror trial in Egyptian history. There was dozens of the former Mujahideen were tried for plotting terrorist acts. It was this betrayal which led bin Laden to place the fatwa on the US, which one way or another led to 9/11. So yeah, I mean, the historical precedent for a major blowback is there.
So let me ask you this. Do you think that any of these weapons through the black market are actually reaching Russia or mercenaries in Russia?
Yeah, there have been reports that some of the biggest customers for black market weaponry are indeed the Russians. I mean, they seem to be particularly interested in NATO and anti-tank and anti-missile weapons. And this was the Mercs that I mentioned have said that this seemed to be what was this seemed to be what was disappearing in vans and stuff. I mean, what's really interesting as well is, I think that the narrative on weaponry to Ukraine has shifted considerably as well. And it's like, when the stuff, if we cut back say 6 months, almost every week we were told that there was a new kind of Wunderwaffen that was going to win the war for Ukraine. Oh, it's the HIMARS, like blah blah. And like, there were people at the time who said that, like, actually these weapons are not very good. And then the way that they're made means that they'll break quite easily. And so that there's a vast amount of weaponry in Ukraine which requires direct US professional servicing to keep working. So I mean, that's another kind of hidden cost of all of these of all of these weapons shipments. But I mean, as well, like, I think that it's one of the reasons that the states are starting to pull back ever so slightly is because it's getting increasingly difficult for them to claim that they're not belligerents in the war. I mean, it's like, some of my reporting for the Grayzone on, leaked documents exposing how senior British spies are, they planned the bombing of Kerch Bridge. They mapped out all of these different operations to be carried out in and around Crimea. They are constructing via a company called Prevail Partners, a secret partisan terror army on behalf of the Odessa SSU, and then mapping out operations for them to carry out. Like, how can London plausibly claim that they're not involved in this? It's just like, it's so brazen. And I think that that there is a cognizance that if a state is directly tied to a major attack on Russian infrastructure, say like Nord Stream 2, then Russia will retaliate against them. And the attitude of some of the more insane kind of hawkish elements within Washington and London, they think that the way to win is just not back down and just keep escalating and ratcheting up tension and making things more dangerous, because they think that Russia's going to eventually going to yield. But there's no sign of it yet, and it's like I am by no means am I a supporter of Russia or indeed the war, but it's like or their war effort. But like if you actually break it down, since February they've been Moscow's been subject to the most wide-ranging array of sanctions in history, which are intended to damage it economically and lead to the the collapse of Putin's government. Ukraine's been getting billions and billions and billions from all over the Western world in weaponry and aid. It's getting non-stop flow of intelligence from MI6 and the CIA. It's getting elite training and all sorts of other support. And
Starlink.
And Starlink as well. And it's just like this has not stopped the Russians. Like, this hasn't stopped them at all. I mean, it might have slowed them down slightly. It's probably prolonged. I mean, we know that Ukraine was very much open to negotiations and had accepted a provisional peace plan in April that was under the terms of which Russia would withdraw from all of Ukraine, and Donetsk and Luhansk would be independent republics. And that was scuttled at the last minute by Boris Johnson, who flew to Kiev and said, "We're not ready for you to back down yet." So if this is being needlessly prolonged, the result seems to be pretty much inevitable. And the longer it goes on, the more dangerous it is for the entire world. I mean, Russia has not indicated that it will use nuclear weapons. Its nuclear doctrine is it only fires if it's fired upon. But I mean, even then, it's like if there is a sufficient threat to Russian interests, it's like, well, if you're going to do things like map out plans to blow up Kerch Bridge, which is a hugely important symbol from the Kremlin's perspective, then that becomes a risk. That becomes a legitimate a legitimate prospect. In the sense of, well, that there is there's an action and a reaction.
Right. And I mean, through this whole conflict, there's been charges of false flag attacks or false flag attacks that were said to occur. Because a lot of folks say too, when you criticize the U.S. government for lying or whatnot, they say, well, look at how the government told the truth that Russia was going to invade in February. But that's not exactly correct, because what the U.S. government had said prior to the start of this conflict was that there was going to be a false flag attack, which there was not. And back in February and March, we heard this often, that there was going to be some kind of false flag, chemical weapons or nuclear type attack. And we've heard that again since then. And we've also had events like Nord Stream 2 and the explosion there, and both sides pointing the finger at each other. Kind of implausibly on one side, I think, that Russia would blow up its own pipeline that the U.S. has been condemning for years. But also, too, we had this missile that landed in Poland, and it seemed as though there was a lot of confusion, especially at first, where there was some unnamed person in the U.S. intelligence community who was saying that this was a missile fired by Russia. It turned out to be a missile fired from Ukraine. Ukraine was still disputing that even after the fact, after NATO and the U.S. came out saying that this was a Ukrainian missile. Ukraine was disputing this. And the timing of that in particular was a little odd, because that came right after the midterm elections, and there was talk at the time of U.S. and Russia holding talks, and they had one meeting in Turkey. And there was pressure from the U.S. government on Ukraine to show a willingness to negotiate with Russia. So we just see this talk of false flag attacks over and over again. So, it's easy to see how this could escalate very quickly if there was, an explosion at a Ukrainian nuclear facility, or if there was, a chemical, biological, nuclear attack on either side. And it may not be clear on who actually committed it. So, I think that's probably, that's the most dangerous route we're going down, on top of not just the uncertainty that can sometimes be faced, where, in the past there's been false alarms, like with weather satellites and things like that. I believe that showed up originally as an ICBM launching. So when you have heightened tensions, it seems, we're really playing with fire, where there could just be some kind of false alarm that could trigger a nuclear holocaust.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that the Ukrainian missile striking Poland, I think it was fascinating, and I because yes, there was the initial, was it deliberate by was it deliberate by Russia, was it a kind of stray trigger pull or whatnot, and then the Ukrainians really ran with this, and I think the fact that very quickly the major NATO officials, and indeed officials in Washington and London, very quickly say, oh no, this wasn't a Russian missile. That shows you that yes, they are extremely worried about getting drawn into a wider war. I think that also shows you that that they are very, very cognizant of the fact that Ukraine is in a fairly desperate position, and in that context it would be willing to carry out false flags in order to prompt London and Washington to haul its chestnuts out of the fire. I think the fact that there was an anonymous official quote afterwards who said that the US was very, very angry that Zelensky had proclaimed that it was a Russian missile when he knew it wasn't. So I mean, that's like almost being fully thrown under the bus there. It's a very, very clear warning that don't do this. The appetites may vary in Britain, where yes, I mean the attitude seems to be just keep ratcheting it up in the hope that the US will come to the rescue. That's not going to happen. And I think that if you look at some of the proposals that have been mooted for a kind of international force to support Ukraine, I mean, they're really quite extraordinary. Where it will be a peacekeeping force with 10,000 soldiers drawn from Poland, 10,000 from the US, and 10,000 from the UK, and we're going to drop them off in Western Ukraine to ensure that things don't that the conflict doesn't spread any further into the country. I mean, it's madness. And again, it raises the very obvious question of how these countries cannot can plausibly claim to not be belligerents in this conflict. It's very, very bizarre, and I think that there seems to be a kind of growing level of acknowledgement at the highest levels. I mean, at least in some quarters within the kind of like Western national security sphere that, okay, right, well, this is actually a really bad situation and we need to kind of rather delicately remove ourselves from it. I mean, that day could come in 6 months, or it could come in a year. The war might be effectively over by that point anyway.
And also too, with these sanctions and just the fact that the economies in the West are so precarious, especially going into the winter, it just begs the question, what is the appetite of the public going to be? How long can this be sustained for in the West, where it's getting more and more expensive for us to heat our homes, and inflation just keeps going up, and food costs can go up. It seems as though the public backlash against this could start growing across the West.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it seems to already be, after this initial burst of pro-Ukraine, pro-war hysteria, across Europe and North America, that seems, particularly in, I can only speak from personal experience, but I think I know a large number of people, across Europe who are in really dire straits as a result of this, and they can't afford to heat their homes, can barely afford to feed themselves, and it's, I think that this winter is scheduled to be less harsh than next winter. It's quite extraordinary. I think that once the reality kicks in, people are going to be begging, demanding, marching for this to be over. It's people are very quick to point to polls in Ukraine that show there is virtually not 100% public support in at least in the west of Ukraine for more weaponry and for Ukraine to fight until it reseizes until it recaptures Crimea. I think that this winter alone, Ukrainians can't have virtually no electricity. They don't have running water. They're cooking using candles. And it's just I think winters in that part of the world are excessively harsh, even if you have the benefit of indoor heating. I think cut to February, and I suspect that Ukraine, a significant proportion of Ukrainians, will just want it over, by any means necessary, whatever the terms.
Well, that kind of dovetails into a patron question that I had for you. And this patron question says, how long before the mainstream narrative on Ukraine completely crumbles like it did for Iraq? Does it even matter? The Western media can keep lying to itself, but it doesn't change the geopolitical realities. And I would just add on top of that question, how do you think this is going to resolve? Are the borders that we're seeing now, is that likely to be what it's going to be at the end of this conflict? Or just, I know you stated, Russia is effectively going to win. Does that mean securing the borders that exist currently?
Yeah, you can make the argument that neither side's going to win. One will just lose slightly to a slightly lesser degree. What Russia's doing now is it's obviously, and it has been for for over a month now, is pummeling Ukrainian resources around electricity, etc. We've seen this in Kherson already, where the Ukrainians very celebratorily marched in, and we're celebrating the recapture. That Kherson's been evacuated now because it has no electricity and no heat, and it's effectively it was a death trap basically to be there over winter. Now the snow setting in, the ground is almost completely frozen. And people face the prospect of starving to death, dying from cold. So I think that that's going to as it gets colder and colder, more and more territory is going to effectively be evacuated, and then thus allowing the Russians to potentially march in. They may capture more territory. I've seen some suggestions that they want to push up to Odessa. I hope that doesn't happen, but who knows that the next phase of this will be decisive. And I think that yes, your questioner referred to the Iraq War. I mean, I think that as with that conflict, when it gets to the point where it's incontestable and incontrovertible that the media's picture of what was happening was completely false, that they'll just carry on as if nothing has happened, and there'll be zero accountability. I think that it will be the psychological impact this will have on the average citizen in the West, I think, could be quite significant. I think it because there was a very interesting article that was published a few weeks ago. I think it was in the New York Times, and it was effectively about life on the front line. It painted this picture of the Ukrainian soldiers, very brave, but kind of in this absolutely hopeless situation, being bombarded with thousands and thousands of shells. They had very little access to food. They're sleeping in extremely harsh circumstances, and kind of bogged down in trenches which are full of water. And it's very like World War I, it painted this picture of this desperate situation. And the response I saw on social media was a large number of people who couldn't process it. They were saying, but how is this the case? The Ukrainians are winning. It's just that level of cognitive dissonance where it's like, or people accusing the New York Times of peddling Russian disinformation and all this other stuff. And I just think that when people have been told since day one that this has been this huge embarrassment and and an epic failure for Russia, and that the Ukrainians have been heroic and successful consistently, that's not been the reality. Quite clearly, by taking the fact that Russia has seized between a fifth and a quarter of Ukraine's territory already. I think that having to square, when reality comes fully crashing, having to square that with what you were told, I think it's going to result in ever more people just not being able to believe in anything. Because it's the classic the way the Western propaganda works is you have all of these ostensibly independent voices, journalists, think tanks, experts, and indeed politicians all saying the same thing, right, thus creating a false illusion of unanimity, and that there is a single acceptable view, or a very, very narrow range of acceptable views on particular matters. The people are going to have to square the fact that they've just been consistently lied to pretty much day in, day out by these grifters, basically.
Unfortunately, I think we've seen narratives crash so much over decades, going back to the Iraq War, and more recently with COVID, and it just seems as though every time a narrative collapses, there is just a new crisis, and people get complete amnesia about what happened. I mean, I honestly don't think many Democrats even remember the Iraq War at this point. I think it's just been wiped from their minds.
Yeah, well, it's just, I mean, I had a very interesting conversation the other day with the individual I know who works for he works in the civil service, which is the administrative, the bureaucracy within the British government, and he is very much on the view that it's impossible to keep a secret. And it occurs to me that that basically that things don't need there's a large number of things which aren't secret, but if nobody knows about them or can remember it or cares about it, then it's as good as secret, really, isn't it? I mean, it's just we have ample documentary evidence that the CIA and MI6 and a large number of neocons and various different organizations were involved for many years in telling outright lies in order to trigger an illegal war of aggression. This was going back all the way to 91. No one's suffered any consequences for it whatsoever, and yes, it's been largely forgotten. So I mean, what does it matter that we know this? And I think that people need, I would hope, I have very little optimism, but I would hope that this would stir people to action and actually try and hold people to account. It's particularly given that, unlike the Iraq War, people are feeling the average person in the West is feeling a material impact from this. They're suffering, as a result. And I mean, it's being sold all over Europe. It's like, your kids will freeze this winter, but like that'll stick it to Vladimir Putin. And it's just like, it's very much it's being framed everywhere. Like, I mean, in the UK, whenever there's any question about the cost of living crisis, it's, this is a necessary evil in order to maintain this proxy war. And it's just like, well, I mean, I don't think that argument has much mileage if you can only eat one meal a day and you're like, you're freezing in your bed at night.
Mm. Well, Kit Klarenberg, I really do appreciate you being on the show today and going over the recent work that you've done for the Grayzone. It's great as always, and I look forward to having you back on in the future to talk about other work that you'll do between now and then. For folks out there who would like to support you, how can they do that?
Yeah, I mean, you can find me on Twitter, and I also have a Substack, if that's what you're into. But I mean, yeah, I greatly appreciate anyone and everyone sharing my work. If you like it, feel free to reach out. I may well answer.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. I really do appreciate your time, and hopefully I can have you back again at some point in the future.
Anytime.